Hey there, I'm Robert from the Rive Creative Team, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I went through and built this racing game menu. Now, it's important to note that this isn't a full menu. It's not a complete menu. There's a lot of different things that could be added, and in later videos, we will add those things. But for now, what we've got is the main navigation that switches out different groups of pages. We'll start with a project overview, so we'll look at the complete menu and see how it looks all together. And then we'll do a component breakdown. So I'll show you how the header works, and then I'll show you how the center component works. And then finally, we will go through the process of combining those components and showing you how they communicate and make each other's state machine work. At the very end of the video, we'll look at some of the mistakes that I made throughout this process so that you can learn from them and not repeat them when you go out and you want to build your own menu. As a last bit of housekeeping, I want to point out that I won't be talking in depth about every single thing that I did. So if I used a particular tool, I'm not going to show you where that tool is located or what buttons I pressed to get to that tool or anything like that. I have linked the Rive 101 playlist down in the description. So if there's a certain tool or process that you're confused about, you can look it up in that playlist and watch a short video on it. Now, I've also pulled out some specific videos that'll help you with the core concepts behind this menu, so you can check those out as well. For those of you who want to gain a deeper understanding of this file, or you want to try and put these components together yourself, I've also included the community file in the description, so you can go there, download it, and do whatever you want with it. All right, with that being said, let's get into it. So here's the entire menu that I've built so far. Now, just keep in mind that this is sort of a top-level page navigator, and it wouldn't take you into any of the sub-pages that would actually be associated with each one of these. Like there'd be a test drive page where you could set up like a practice drive or a quick race that would just get you right into a race or dealership where you could buy new cars. We don't have those pages, but I can show you in another video how we would actually set that up and get our menu to actually go to those pages. And we have these different page selectors that you can navigate through with this header. And you can see as we select different portions of the header, our pages update. And when we go to a different page, if let's say, for example, we select the test drive and we go to garage, then the whole thing sort of resets back to its normal configuration and ensures that the first option is selected. Now, this menu is built of two top-level components. So we've got our header component, and then we've got this page select component. Now, later on in the video, we'll break down how the state machine is set up and all the inputs and things like that we're going to be changing. But before we can do any of that, we need to go and look at each individual component. So we'll start with the header component, and then we'll look at this page select component. So here's the header component, and it's fairly simple as far as the setup and the type of motion that we're creating. We've got three separate states. We've got home, garage, and settings. Now, these states define the state that our component is in. So for example, when the home state is active, the home text font is a little bit bigger. And we also have this trim path line right here that is just a line segment that we've defined. And then we're defining the offset of that line segment. So with home, the line segment is here, and this text is that size, and these are their default sizes. And then when we go to garage, the trim path is offset a little bit more, and then garage is bigger. And then when we go to settings, once again, the trim path goes to the end, and then the settings text is a little bit bigger. So you can see that the states that we've defined are not all that complex, and we get the motion that we have by setting it up on the any state. Now, by doing it on the any state, we're accounting for any transition order that we want to go between with only 3 transitions. Whereas if we wanted to set up a dedicated transition for each one, we'd have to do it like this, where we go from entry to home, because that's always going to be the first one that we go to. And then from home, we can go to garage, and then home, we can go to settings. And then from each one of these, we could get to the other states too. So from settings, we could go to home, Settings, we could go to garage, and then from garage, we could go to settings, and then from garage, we could go to home. So now you can see we've got twice as many transitions that we have to configure. We've got to put our inputs in there. And to create the motion, I'm using duration and interpolation. Now, the reason that I'm using duration and interpolation for all this stuff is because I have quick control over how long this animation takes and the actual motion that's happening. And all I have to update is two settings, the duration and the interpolation. So you can see that now we've got a different motion. If that's too fast, we could slow it down. We could even give it more overshoot and anticipation if we wanted to. And you can see just how fast I'm doing that. And I'm doing it all while the state machine is running so that I can just quickly make those updates and then test things out. But I'm going to set it back to how I had it before, which is just a duration of 100 and then this cubic interpolation. Now, on top of that, we've got listeners set up so that when I click on each one of the header objects, the menu index changes, and that's the name of the input that we're going to be using. And I use that naming convention anytime I have sort of a list of things, whether it's a list of text or a list of images that you could click on to get between. That's just the menu index. So the first is always 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then, so on and so forth. Now, up to this point, we haven't done anything that's super complex. The only thing here that you might not be familiar with is events. Now, each one of these different options fires off two events. The first one is either home, garage, or settings. And then the second one is called group switch. Now, the group switch event fires off before the home, garage, or settings event happens. And there's a reason for this, and I'll show you what the reason for that is when we look at the next component. But you'll see that these events fire off based on the transition. They're not attached to the listener. They're based on the transition. And the reason that they're on the transition and not being fired from the listener is that if we wanted to set this up to be usable with a controller, the only thing that the controller can do is control this input and not actually fire off a listener. So we want to make sure that each time a different one of these options is selected, group switch happens first, and then the second event fires off. So you can see on each transition, the group switch fires off at the start. And then depending on which state that we're going into, whether it's settings, garage, or home, that correlated event goes off at the end of the transition. Now, again, this setup is going to make a little bit more sense once we look at the next component. Now, the next component is the page select component. This component is slightly more complex. The motion is being created in the same way that we did before, but there's a handful of additional keys and inputs and options that we actually can change in this. And so let's go over those. Let's start with the motion first. I set up the states the exact same way I did with the header. I've got 4 different states, and each one is for the different pages that you could select. So this state is what the component looks like when the first page is selected. Animation 2 is when the second page is selected. 3 is when the third one's selected. And 4 is when the fourth one is selected. Now you can see that each one of these animations only has a single key for each property. And that's because we have all these animations hooked up to the any state. And again, that accounts for all of our different transitions. And then we're creating the motion with our duration and interpolation. So that way we can update the motion at any time and we can do it fairly quickly. Now, on top of the box changing vertex keys, or these different shapes changing the vertex keys, we also have a shape that is associated with each different box. And if you open this up, you can see it right here. It's this rectangle and it's a saturation layer. So when the saturation layer is set at 0%, then the image is black and white. And when the saturation is at 100%, then the image is in color. And so that's what I'm using to change the image from black and white to color. And then we also have this text piece that animates in at the bottom. Now, this text piece is an additional artboard, and it only has an on and off state that you can toggle in between using this Boolean. And then the other layer that's on here has all of the different text strings. So it's one component that I've duplicated 4 times. And then I can change the text depending on which position it's in. Now, this is going to be a little more important in a minute, because you can see we have quite a bit of text listed in here. And the reason that I broke this off into its own component is because I just wanted to animate this one time and then reuse that animation in each one of the different pages. Now, it's important to note that both of these inputs are actually exposed to the parent artboard. And that way, when I go here and I drop that in, I can create some listeners that can control when the particular text, this page text animation actually plays. So you can see I'm doing that here. And what we're doing is we've got a listener that is targeting the artboard, and that will allow us to listen for any of these different events that go off. So when option 1 goes off and option 1 fires off, whenever we make this transition, you can see we've got this option 1 at the start of this transition, fire off this event. And when that event goes off, we set the Boolean, that is hovered Boolean, from this artboard here. Remember, we nested it 4 times. You can see it here. Mode text 2, mode text 3, and mode text 4. So there's 4 instances of this. So now we just have to configure the Booleans for all 4 of these depending on which button we select. So when we select the first button or the first page, our Booleans are set to this one is true and these 3 are false. And then in the next one, this one is true and the other 3 are false. And then that pattern repeats. We're on the 3rd one. This one is true, the other ones are false. And then the last one, this one is true and the other 3. And so depending on which option we select, it just changes the configurations of our Booleans, and that text option is displayed down there at the bottom and plays that build-in animation. Now, if you remember back to the project overview, then you know that this component is actually being used 3 times, depending on if you hit home, garage, or settings. Now, I incorporated all of that stuff into this component because the only things that are changing are the background images, the text down here, and then what the text on that build-in says. Now, these mode text strings can be updated at any time. You can see we can either update the text string here, or we can define them in an animation. So that's all I've done, is I've got another layer in the state machine, and it's this layer here, and it basically allows me to change the configuration of the background images, the text, and what those built-in text objects are gonna say. So if we go into component 1, you can see that we have text run animations here. So we've defined what the text says for component 1. We've defined what the text string value is of that built-in text. And we've got a solo in each one of these that switches out our different images for the different pages. So I've switched that out for all the different components. You can see component 2, we have collection, design, paint, driver, tuner shop. Component 3, gameplay, video, audio, controls. And you can imagine that the same thing is happening with the background images and the text for the other, this animated text piece. So you can see that this is our component 1, And then we have a input here called page group, and that allows us to switch between our different component animations. So one, now we're on, a whole set of new background images and text at the bottom. And then once again, for the third component, because we're going to reuse this component 2 more times. Now, the last thing that's in this is the isOpen Boolean, and this plays a closed and open animation. Now, this is the only animation that I actually did custom animating on, aside from that text. And this one's interesting because I did have to use 4 sets of rectangles to actually get this to work. So you can see we've got a white rectangle and a red rectangle, and then I had to duplicate that 4 times. Anyways, the reason for that is that these shapes right here can't be put on the same shape layer, and that's because of the way that clipping works. So we had to make sure that each one of these shapes is its own shape so that we can clip the background images. And then we needed, to do that open animation, we needed a red rectangle for each one of the shapes and a white rectangle. So really what I did was I made one big, I made this set right here, a red rectangle, a white rectangle. I animated it and then duplicated these 2 objects 4 times, and then just changed the clipping on each one of those objects so that it was clipped to the right rectangle. So it's not too complex. I would suggest downloading the file and looking at how this is all set up if you're curious. Now, I'm pretty sure I already mentioned this, but the listeners that we have on here, we have our standard mouse down listener to switch between all of our different pages here. And then we have these, and these fire off option 1, 2, 3, 4. Option 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason that I kept it as option 1, 2, 3, and 4 is that later, when we actually build in the sub pages that you could go to, we'll need to know which one of these options that we selected. So in addition to configuring our Booleans of this nested artboard, it's also going to help us tell this artboard which one of those is selected. Now that's going to be for a different video, but at this point, I think we understand how all of the components are set up. Again, if you have more questions on how these components are set up or how the animations were created or anything like that, download the file and try to look at it yourself and explore it a little bit. So now that we're at this point, let's go in and actually put these components together, and I can show you how we're going to need to configure all of our different inputs and listeners. Okay, so now that we've gone through each one of the components, we've talked about their events, and we've talked about the different inputs available to us, let's use all those events and use those to control the different inputs from each one of our different components. Now, the only thing that I've done to this point to set up this menu is I've added in an artboard. It's set to 1920 by 1080. It's got a gradient fill on it. And I have 2 nested artboards added to that artboard. So we've got one that has the page header on it and another that has the page select artboard on it. If we go into animate mode and play our state machine now, you'll see that each one of those nested artboards sort of works. The clicked interactions that we have set up work, but we can't see the images on the page select. And when we move our tab around, we're not actually resetting it to the right configuration or anything like that. And in fact, this component itself doesn't even look right. And that's because if you remember, this page select has an isOpen animation that needs to play before we can even see these different images. So the first thing that I want to set up is make sure that when we click on the different tabs here, that the isOpen Boolean actually goes from false to true. So let's start by adding in some listeners. Now, we're going to add in 4 listeners, and the reason for this is going to become more clear as we move along. But when we target an an artboard. So let's say, for example, this page header, which is what we're going to use to drive the changes on this component. We have the ability to listen for all of the different events that happen. Now, if you remember back from when we talked about this page header, we have the home, garage, settings, and group switch events. So I'm going to go ahead and make a listener that listens for each one of those individual events. So the first one is going to listen for the home event. The second one is going to listen for garage. The third one is going to listen for settings. And the fourth one is going to listen for group switch. Now, if you don't remember how those events are reported, if we go back here and we play our state machine, you can see that when the transition happens between one of those, the first thing that plays is group switch. That's the first event that signals, and then the event that's associated with the button. So when I click settings, it fires off the group switch event and then the settings event. And when I go to home, it's group switch event and then home, and then garage is group switch and then garage. Now the order of that is very important because what we want to do is go in and make sure that whenever home, garage, or settings is selected up here, we toggle the is open Boolean to true because by default, it starts at false. So you can see now, whenever we open up or start the state machine, just by listening for home, and because that home transition plays right away, the Boolean for is open is set to true. Now we want to make sure that that is the same on all of our other ones. So garage and settings as well. And remember, when I click on garage, that Boolean is going to go to true. When I click on settings, that Boolean is going to go to true. But we don't have a way to turn it to false yet so that we can see it play every time we switch to a different tab. And that's where the group switch event comes in. When the group switch event goes off, we want this is open Boolean to go to false. So now, anytime we switch, the group switch event fires first and sets the is open Boolean to false. So it basically closes the page. And then when we go, or the next step is that whatever garage, settings, home, that event plays, it reopens it. So it makes it look like this component is 3 different components. So that's the first step. We've got our images displaying and we've got our text displaying. We've got that is open Boolean turning on and off, and we have that animation playing exactly how we want it to. The next thing that I want to do is set up an animation that can control the different images and text depending on which one of these tabs we click on. So let's create some animations on this artboard. The first one is going to be called home. The next one is going to be called garage. And the last one is going to be called settings. Now, one of the things that we can do with nested artboards that have inputs exposed is we can set what those inputs are as keys on a timeline. So if you remember back to when we talked about this component, there is an input called page group that changes out the images and the text of all the different page options. So when we're at home, we want this page group to be set to 0 because that's going to show us all the images and text that's associated with the home tab. And when we go to the garage tab, we want that page group number to be set to 1. And that again will switch out all the images and all the text. And then finally, we want our page group to be set to 2 when we go to settings. So now, as we switch back and forth between these, it should update the text and the images. But we also need to add these to our state machine. So let's add those in. Home, settings, garage. Add in some transitions like this. And then we need another input to actually control these. And we've got this one called page group. So we're going to add this page group number as a condition so that when page group is 0, we're at home. When page group is 1, garage. When page group is 2, we go to settings. Now it's important to note that this page group number input is different than the page group number input that's in our page select nested artboard. Just something to note, I didn't actually create it here. I created it before the recording so that it's already here. All right, now if we play our animation and we switch this number input, you can see that all of our images are now updating, and so are the text values down in the bottom. So when we're at 0, we have all our race pages. 2, we've got all our settings pages, and when we're at 1, we've got all our garage settings. Now we want this object up here to actually control this input. So when we click on home, we want this page group number input to be 0. When we click on garage, we want it to change to 1. When we click on settings, we want it to go to 2. So let's just incorporate those into the listeners that we have. So when home event goes off, because remember that's what happens when we click on the home button, let's set the page group to 0. And when garage event goes off, let's set the page group to 1. And then when settings goes off, let's set the page group, that's the wrong page group. It's this page group to 2. Now when we play our state machine, every time we switch, we have not only the images and text switch out, we have that on animation play. So we're basically set up and ready. The only thing here that I want to change is that just because, if you're on the home tab and you select test drive, when we go to garage, we may not want driver to be selected. In fact, we probably want every time we switch for our menu to be selecting that first option, whether it's home, garage, or settings, no matter which one of these that we've selected. So to do that, we need to make sure that anytime one of these events goes off, we also control the menu index. That's the other input that we have available to us. So let's go to the home, this listener right here that listens for the home event, and go into and grab menu index. So when the page header, when the home event goes off, we want to make sure that the menu index for this component is set to 0. And then we want to do the same thing on the next one. Menu index 0. The last one, input change, menu index 0. So that makes sure that the option, when we switch between these, always goes back to this first option being selected. So you can see that now we can change to like test drive and then go to settings. And you can see that the menu shifts back to its original configuration, and the first option is selected, no matter which page we do that on, because anytime one of these events goes off, we reset this component back to its default state. We toggle that is open Boolean to true, and then we're also changing the different page group depending on which one of these tabs that we're selecting. All right, I know that was a lot of information, and a lot of it might have been confusing. If you haven't seen events and listeners before and this sort of interaction, then I'm sure this was just total gibberish, and I understand that. For those of you who do understand how events and listeners and all this stuff actually works, I hope you got something out of this. If you have questions, which I'm sure many folks are going to, leave a comment, ask. Also, download the file, check it out, try to build this on your own, and then try to make a menu that sort of replicates this on your own, because it's one thing to just, get an idea from all of this, but it's a whole other thing to build it by yourself. And you'll really gain some understanding of, how I came up with the inputs and the different process that I use to put all this stuff together. Because when I'm building it, it goes a little bit faster because I know exactly what each one of these things does. Now, I told you in the intro that I was going to show you some mistakes that I made working on this. So let me show you an earlier iteration of this project. There were two minor mistakes that I made. Well, there was probably three. The first is my naming convention. So this is the other version of the project, the one before I actually filmed this. And one of the problems was the naming convention. So my naming convention was kind of all out of whack. I didn't really have a good idea of what to call each one of these things. I was calling this the page toggle when really it's like more of a group of pages toggle. So I ended up just calling it a header because that's what it kind of is. And then these were called mode selects. I probably just should have called them page selects. It might have made a little bit more sense. So that was the first thing that I didn't like that I did. The second was that this page select menu here, I duplicated it twice instead of building it all into one component. And updated all of the images and the text, which worked fine. But when I actually went and added it all to the menu, you're going to see one problem that there was no way to fix. Now, this setup's a little bit different. If you remember in the different animations that we created on the other main state machine, we had the same ones, home, garage, and settings. But what we were doing was we changed out one of the inputs here. We keyed the input. Now, in this case, this is three different components that I'm just toggling on and off using a solo. And so depending on which one of these animations is active, the different component is displayed. Now this would normally be fine, but if we play our state machine, let's say we have this selected and we go to garage, all that stuff snaps over. It looks fine. And we go to like tuner shop here and then we go back to garage. What you'll notice is that all of that stuff continues to sort of switch around. So like you would assume that that other one would have already reset. But when we go back to garage, those little boxes here actually slide over again. And the problem with that is even though I'm updating the, like you'll see that the menu index as we go through these. All right, so that one's on 2. And if we go to a different one, it is set to 0, but this update doesn't actually take place until we reactivate that solo, which is why we get that sliding. And so that was a minor mistake that I made. I didn't really realize that that was going to happen, but it makes sense because we're basically, I want to say we're stopping the state machine. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there, but I guess we're restarting the state machine or redisplaying the state machine. So this input isn't actually updating when the solo is turned off. So that was one mistake that I made by using 3 different mode select components instead of just building them all into one. And then the other thing that I did that I'm not 100% sure why I did it. Let me go to this page text thing over here. Let me drag it back over. Now, one thing that I was messing around with when Nested Artboards first came out was the fact that you could build different state machines depending on what you needed out of a specific component. So in this case, I had I had 3 different state machines, and each one of them, the only difference, they both had the on and off animation. The only difference was the second layer that had the text string animations on it. For some reason, I thought it'd be a good idea to have 3 different state machines, each one with a different layer 2 that had a different set of text strings. I don't know why I did that. Instead, all I needed to do was have one state machine with the on and off animations, and then a layer that has all the different text strings that I needed. And so that's what I ended up changing out in this project. I also combine all these components into one state machine or one component, And that, you know, it in the long run, it did sort of cut down on the amount of animation that I needed to do for all this stuff. And it did make the state machine a little more complex, but honestly, this is probably a much more scalable and updatable model, because let's say, for example, Big Boss Man comes in and says, hey, we actually need a 5th option for all of these different panels here. Like we have an option 5. So I'd need to add in a new option 5. And by splitting this component into 3 separate components, if I have to update the animation for these shapes sliding, for example, I would have to update that for each one of my different components. So this was a mistake, building it as scalable as possible, putting it all onto one component, and then having the different elements within that component switch out based on some input was the better way to do it. So those are the mistakes that I made. I hope you learn from them. Make fun of me in the comments if you want. You know, that's all good. I invite it. So yeah, like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. And yeah, we will see you in the next video.